Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Yemi. It's a pleasure to speak to this organization. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. So I'm going to speak today about the movement called effective altruism and its relation to one of my interests in my professional life, moral psychology. Let me share my screen because I do have some diagrams. Here we go. Pardon me for the delay. Here we go. And you are screen sharing. Okay. Michelle, is my screen visible? You're muted, so I can't hear you, but I'm going to assume that it is. What is effective altruism? It is a movement in practical ethics, in how we ought to live our lives, that originated in academic philosophy. Perhaps its first originator was the philosopher Peter Singer at Princeton University, and author of a number of books, including The Expanding Circle, Animal Liberation, The Life You Can Save, and The Most Good You Can Do, both of which are give away the key idea of effective altruism. Now let's see, I have a chat here. Anything critical? No, I will continue. The movement was given its name by two young philosophers at Oxford, Will MacAskill, founder of the Center for Effective Altruism in 80,000 Hours and the author of Doing Good Better, and Toby Ord, also of the University of Oxford, founder of the Future of Humanity Institute and Giving What We Can, and the author of The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity. So what is effective altruism? It's basically the idea that we can do good better, that we should we should organize our lives to benefit as many people as possible. Some of the arguments that have come out of the philosophy are that wealthy and middle-class people should donate most of their income and wealth to charity. This originated in the 1970s in a paper that Singer wrote, which gave rise to the muddy pond thought experiment. Imagine you were driving along, you saw a child who was drowning in a muddy pond. You could rescue the child, but if you did, you would ruin an expensive pair of shoes by getting them muddy. Most people would think that it would be ethically monstrous to let the child drown just to enjoy an expensive pair of shoes. But Singer argues that, in effect, we are making the same decision every day when we consume luxuries like restaurant meals, like clothing, like vacations, when we could donate the equivalent amount to charity and through public health measures like drugs and sanitation, save the lives of children who would die, particularly in the developing world. The fact that they are halfway across the world, the fact that we don't know them personally, ought to be utterly irrelevant to the moral decision at hand. Why should the life be worth less just because the person is a few more miles away, or you just haven't been formally introduced to them? The moral imperative to give away most of your money if you live in an affluent part of the world comes from an old finding in economics, the decelerating utility of money. Here is a graph that looks fancier than it is. This is objective income. This is happiness or well-being. And the curve bends over, which is another way of saying that an extra $1,000 means a whole lot more to a poor person than it does to a rich person. If the rich person relinquishes the $1,000, donates it to a poor person, there's a lot more happiness in the world. Another not so obvious implication of effective altruism is that people should not prioritize their own children in moral decisions. So imagine there's a burning building. You could go into a school. You could run into one door, save your child. You could run into another door to save 5 children who are not related to you. There is no good moral reason to favor your own child. For that matter, even if there was one child at each door, morally, perhaps you should flip a coin. The fact that we are attached to our biological relatives is a legacy of evolution, of kin selection. It is a way that genes get themselves into the next generation, but it should have no moral worth. Moreover, when people are donating most of their income to charity, they should pay close attention to which charities are effective, where effective can be defined precisely as yielding the greatest number of quality-adjusted life years per dollar donated. That is, how many years you live and how good are those years, taking into account disease and disability. Not what's personally relevant. A lot of people think that they should donate to charities that are that have some connection to them. If your dad died of liver disease, you should donate to a charity for research on liver diseases. But the effective altruist arguments suggest that that is ethically irrelevant. Not for a warm glow. Who the hell cares how it feels to you when you donate? That has no moral standing. What matters is how many quality-adjusted life years you add to the world by your donation. If you do those calculations, the result is that your dollar goes the furthest to adding to human well-being if you contribute to public health in poor countries. This is the kind of calculation, for example, that led Bill Gates to donate the bulk of his fortune to public health measures in the developing world. Moreover, you should pay close attention to efficacy, that there are massive differences across charities that are directed at the same cause, say clean water or malaria prevention. Some of them can save 10 times as many lives per dollar spent. There's a moral imperative to figure out which charity is most effective. If you donate to a charity that saves 10 times as many children, it's the same as donating 10 times as much money. A couple of examples of meta charities closely associated with the effective altruism movement are GiveWell and Giving What We Can. They are not like Charity Navigator, which a lot of people are familiar with in choosing among charities. That is, they don't just look at percentage of receipts that go to administration, because a well-administered charity can actually be more effective, even if it absorbs more dollars in calculating where the money ought to go. But rather, the bottom line is how many lives are saved, how many quality-adjusted life years are added to the world. Another implication of effective altruism is that people should choose careers that promise to do the most good. The organization 80,000 Hours alludes to the fact that our careers comprise 80,000 hours of work, and there are massive differences in how much good you can do based on the career that you choose. In particular, and this is one of the not so obvious counterintuitive implications of effective altruism, people should earn who can earn large salaries ought to do so on ethical grounds and give most of it away, an idea called earning to give, with the implication that a hedge fund manager, at least someone who is capable of being an effective hedge fund manager, can actually be more moral than a soup kitchen volunteer if they donate the massive amounts that they earn to effective charities. Another counterintuitive implication is that we should, if we are scanning the entire world of morally relevant patients, morally relevant entities, and figuring out how can our efforts, how can our dollars do the most good in the world, we should look at all of the animals that are suffering, most obviously in factory farms. There's a massive amount of suffering that could be prevented if we allocate our attention there. And perhaps even in the wild, there is a lot of pain and suffering of all those animals that get eaten alive after moments of sheer terror. Should we think about conservation policies that take into account the welfare of animals? You see a lot of arguments from conservationists about, say, rewilding. Let's reintroduce wolves because it will naturally control the deer population. No one thinks about it from the deer's point of view. And that species is irrelevant, just as race is irrelevant in assessing the moral worth of humans. The fact that you occupy one slot in the land taxonomy versus another should hold no moral weight. What matters is, are you capable of flourishing or suffering? Yet another implication is that we should prioritize the existence and welfare of future generations. Another morally irrelevant trait is whether you happen to be born in the 20th or 21st century as opposed to the 22nd, 23rd, or 24th century. A person is a person. What difference does it make what century you happen to be born in? We have billions, perhaps trillions of unborn future descendants, at least potential ones. So we should, since an existential threat, a catastrophe that extinguishes our species, say a nuclear war followed by a nuclear winter that chokes off sunlight and prevents food from being grown, leading to the starvation of the entire human species, should be given more priority than catastrophes like climate change, which could cause a lot of suffering, displacement, hunger, disease, but won't wipe out the last human, and therefore won't wipe out the exponentially increasing number of descendants that we could have. Extinction is forever, and that means that there are trillions of lives that could never come into existence if we wipe out the species. So we should prioritize averting existential catastrophes, even those with minuscule probabilities. To take the extreme example suggested by Elliot Yankowski, imagine that we had an artificial intelligence that was not suitably programmed to take into account all contingencies. We gave it the task of maximizing number of paper clips, and so it sought any source of raw materials, including the iron in our bloodstreams, and committed mass genocide because it was one of the ways to accomplish its goal of making as many paper clips as possible, and bye-bye Homo sapiens. Now, you might say that is a wild, inconceivably, infinitesimally improbable contingency. On the other hand, if you multiply the cost, trillions of people who would never come into existence, then even if the probability is small, the overall expectation of the harm could be large enough that we ought to devote thought and resources into preventing it from happening. It comes from the theory of expected utility, a rational choice, where utility, meaning basically goodness, stuff we like, is the product of the probability of the event times its value. Something that has a high value, life into the indefinite future, can compensate for low probability because that's the way multiplication works. Well, a natural reaction to this line of argument, especially as you start to extend it to its more remote implications, is, isn't this getting kind of weird? And it kind of is. And a response from advocates of effective altruism taken to its remote conclusions is, yeah, but weirdness has nothing to do with it. Human moral intuitions can be demonstrably immoral. We should base morality on rationality alone, no matter how weird and unintuitive and counter to our intuitions a conclusion would appear to be. So that's going to lead me to the part of the lecture where that impinges on my own interests as a psychologist and a cognitive scientist, namely effective altruism is motivated by the difference between morality and the moral sense. And that's what I will now turn my attention to. So these are not the same thing. They allude to a distinction that is often made in cognitive psychology, psychology in general, between a normative question, that is, how we ought to reason, how we ought to behave, a norm, versus a descriptive question, how human beings, members of Homo sapiens, do think, reason, and behave. It's common, for example, in studies of human reasoning and rationality to have some benchmark, some ground truth of optimal inference, like, say, Bayes' theorem in the case of reasoning from evidence, and then to ask the question, are human schlemiels as good as Bayesian theory says they ought to be, or do we use some rule of thumb or shortcut or other fallacy that falls short of that normative theory? Now, in the case of moral questions, the distinction between normative and descriptive questions still arises, though it's a little less intuitive. A normative question is, what is right and wrong, according to our best reasoning, as contrasted with the branch of psychology, which asks, how do people think and feel about what is right and wrong, opening up the possibility that these are not the same thing, that just as people's number sense can be out of whack with the laws of arithmetic, their intuitive probability can fall short of the normative standards established by Bayes' theorem or signal detection theory. Our moral intuitions might differ from the best morality that we can articulate. It raises the possibility that there are moral illusions, things that we think are moral and immoral, but in fact are not. Why would this discrepancy arise? Well, evolution endowed us with a moral sense, just as it endowed us with color vision and emotions like fear and disgust and anger and sexual desire. In the case of the moral sense, it may be a solution to the problem of cooperation in a social species. And we see evidence that there is such a thing as the moral sense. It does seem to be a faculty, a module, if you wish, of the human mind. We see that even infants and toddlers show moral inklings, such as helping a person in need and sympathy for someone who is in pain. Ethnographers tell us that across the world's cultures, across the massive diversity in moral systems, there is a moral psychology, a moral sense. People all over the world distinguish right from wrong. They have a sense of fairness. They help one another. They impose rights and obligations. They believe that wrongs should be redressed, and they prescribe certain kinds of violence, although crucially, not all. In fact, a lot of human violence is considered moral, not immoral in many of the world's cultures, not least our own. I will put that aside. It is a topic I have written about at length in my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. But the moral sense is a thing. It is a part of our psychology. It can be presumably impaired in psychopathy, either innate or acquired. There do seem to be people who are utterly indifferent to the suffering of others and are callous and rapacious, consider other people to be just resources to be exploited. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt, one of the pioneers in moral psychology, has suggested that most of our moral intuitions arise as an emotional reaction. And he has some famous thought experiments. Actually, they're also real experiments because he gave them to experimental participants. I'll give you perhaps the most famous of the famous. Imagine that Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They are traveling together in a summer vacation from college. One night they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep the night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? Now, the majority of Haidt's subjects say that no, it was not okay, that what they did was immoral. But then when asked to justify it, every one of their arguments, they quickly realized does not apply. Well, there could be a child with a birth defect. Well, no, they took extra precautions to use contraception. Well, they could, it would interfere with having a normal and healthy romantic life, finding a partner. No, they never were going to do it again. Oh, there could be trauma and disgust, but no, that was ruled out. Finally, the participants say, I don't know, I can't explain it, I just know it's wrong. That which Haidt called moral dumbfounding. The source of moral dumbfounding is a kind of, in this case, a kind of cross-wiring between another feature of our psychology, repugnance at incest, namely an adaptation that prevents us from wasting our reproductive effort on the possibility of conceiving a child who would be born with a defect or reduced fitness, because recessive deleterious alleles can meet up with themselves with a higher probability when genetic relatives reproduce. That is, the thought of having sex with your brother, with your mother, with your aunt and uncle, at least if you've grown up with them and they feel like your sister or aunt and uncle or parent, is horrific. Deborah Lieberman, Lita Cosmides, and John Tooby, evolutionary psychologists, have shown that people whose incest avoidance is engaged, is triggered, namely they actually have opposite sex siblings. If you grow up as an only child, if you grow up without an opposite sex sibling, then it's just the possibility never arises, and the whole psychology of incest avoidance could lie dormant. What they find is that people who just having if you're a male, you have a sister. If you're a female, you have a brother. They are more likely to condemn consensual brother-sister incest among others as immoral. So it's good evidence that there is this leakage or contamination between your own disgust at the thought of having sex with your brother and your moral judgment of third parties. This is clearly an illusion, because whether your other sibling happens to be male or female should make no difference as to whether two strangers are doing something wrong if they consensually have sexual relations. Just the phenomenon of moral illusions and moral dumbfounding is not just a matter of incest. I'll just give you a few more of Haidt's scenarios. A woman is cleaning out her closet. She finds her old American flag. She doesn't want the flag anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her bathroom. No one is hurt. Is this wrong? Many, perhaps most people say that it is wrong, presumably because there's some intuition of loyalty to your coalition or group that is being symbolically violated, which bleeds over into a moral judgment. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They heard the dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a dead chicken, but before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it, and he cooks it and eats it. Again, it's hard to put your finger on what is morally wrong with any of these actions, but people have a strong intuition that they are wrong. So these could be called moral illusions, that our disgust, our discomfort from nonconformity to tribal disloyalty applies to morally innocent acts. Moral illusions are not just clever stimuli in experiments in moral psychology or in thought experiments around the philosophy seminar table. There is an argument, I've made it, that a lot of arguments in bioethics have been contaminated by a yuck factor, which ought to be given no credence as a moral argument, but tends to bleed into our moral intuitions if we are not aware of them. For example, is cloning immoral? This was a fierce controversy about 20 years ago. Most people think that this would be a breach in the moral fabric of the cosmos, that nothing could be more depraved. In fact, cloning just consists of having a child that is an identical twin of a living child and conceived through in vitro fertilization rather than the usual way. It's really hard to identify anything that would be morally harmful with cloning, assuming that the procedure itself was not likely to introduce birth defects, but that isn't where the objection to cloning comes from. Should organ donors be compensated? That is, for someone who altruistically donates a kidney to save the life of someone else who needs one. Should they get a contribution to their retirement fund? Should they get a credit for college tuition? Should their hospital expenses be paid for? These, by the way, are felonies. The answer is no. Whereas one could make a very strong moral argument that these prohibitions, called commodifying human organs, result in needless deaths and suffering, and that compensation of organ donors should be allowed. Some people believe that you should be able to sell your kidneys on eBay. There could be vouchers for poor people who couldn't afford to bid, so it's not a question of equity, but it would lead to greater good in the world. A lot of people, again, have a yuck reaction, but is this yuck reaction morally defensible? One of the reasons that we can suspect that, and I have argued that a lot of the field of bioethics is making bogus arguments based on contamination from moral illusions, is that the history of bioethical debate shows many examples where a unfamiliar new procedure appeared on the scene. There were moralistic arguments against them in their time. The people came to realize that the arguments were invalid, that they actually would increase suffering. We got over them, and now it's hard to recall what the fuss was about. For example, in vitro fertilization, I'm old enough to remember when there was the first, as they used to call it, test tube baby in the 1980s, Louise Brown. Now this is considered a moral no-brainer. There are hundreds of thousands of people conceived by in vitro, including, I'm sure, many of the people watching today. Is this in any way, shape, or form immoral? I think we all realize now the answer is no, but at the time, this was a raging debate. Artificial insemination in the 1950s was considered immoral. Organ transplants, there's some violation of some natural order. Blood transfusions, more than a century ago, were considered ethically problematic. Vaccination, to take an issue that sadly has become relevant once again. Even anesthesia. If you go down to the Public Garden in downtown Boston, you'll see a gorgeous sculpture called the Anesthesia Monument, commemorating the discovery of general anesthesia at Mass General Hospital in the room, first shown in the room still called the Ether Dome. But at the time, there were arguments that this was unnatural, that it would be that there's a reason for suffering. Perhaps God has his own design. Perhaps he's punishing people for their sins. Perhaps people will no longer take good care of themselves if they know that they could be anesthetized when a limb is sawed off or an organ is removed. Now we kind of scratch our heads and say, what were they thinking? This is another moral no-brainer. But at the time, it was unnatural, it triggered a yuck reaction, and that it was illicitly moralized. And homosexuality and interracial marriage, not in ancient history, in my lifetime. I remember the arguments. The moral is that sometimes we must discount our moral illusions to arrive at what history will show will be the most defensible moral positions. And not just that fashions change, some years homosexuality is immoral, some years it's moral, but rather homosexuality really is not immoral, and the people who said it was were mistaken. So is morality just a gut feeling? Well, I've been reading this discussion on the assumption that it is not. There is a view that since we do have strong but indefensible moral intuitions, perhaps morality, like incest avoidance, like fear of heights and snakes, is just an evolutionary adaptation, in this case getting the benefits of cooperation. So it is worth just recalling, just to, again, ground this whole discussion, that the answer is not necessarily. The fact that we have a moral sense does not mean that morality is nothing but an adaptation, though there are moral philosophers who will defend that position. But just as the fact that we have visual illusions, the fact that we often get confused by adding numbers, the fact that we make blunders in logic, none of those mean that geometry is a figment of our imaginations. At least there is a defensible position that geometry is not just a figment of our imaginations, but it means that there are normative systems, there's human psychology, they can fall out of whack. So in theory, there could be a objective normative basis to morality, a kind of ground truth against which we can compare human intuitions. even if we evolve with the moral sense with its quirks and illusions. And just to tie this back to the original topic of this lecture, this would be part of the justification from effective altruism of why there may be conclusions that seem deeply weird, even though they are backed by strong arguments. The weirdness may be something that we should discount as an artifact of our psychology. The theory is sometimes called moral realism, compared to mathematical realism. Mathematical realism or Platonism is that there really are things out there, mathematical truths in some abstract realm that our mathematical cognition makes contact with. Perhaps there is a correct answer as to right or wrong, and which we may or may not approximate. Now, what could this possibly be? Well, there's one obvious answer is, well, that's what religion is for. God gives us commandments. That's where morality comes from. I won't go into the problems with that argument, among them that God, for example, prescribed the death penalty for homosexuality, but he gave rape and slavery a pass. So forget religion as a basis for an objective morality. Probably the best argument that morality is not just a quirk of our psychology, normatively speaking, comes from the concept of impartiality, or the interchangeability of perspectives. And this is an argument that has been made effectively by Hobbes. And by that, I don't mean Thomas Hobbes, the great 17th century English philosopher, but Hobbes, the cartoon tiger companion of Calvin. And one of my favorite comic strips, because it illustrates such a profound point in philosophy, is the following one. Calvin announces to Hobbes one day, "I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the ends justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good. That's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to. Let others argue about whether it's, quote, right, unquote, or not. Hey," he shouts as Hobbes shoves him into the mud, "why'd you do that?" Hobbes says, "You were in my way, now you're not. The ends justify the means." And Calvin says, "I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me." Hobbes says, "Ah." Well, Hobbes has just identified the problem of any rule of life that says just me. It doesn't make any sense. I can't privilege my interests over yours just because I'm me and you're not, and expect you to take me seriously. Now, of course, if I was a galactic overlord, if I was the only person in the universe, and I didn't care what other people thought, did not have to persuade them of anything, including refraining from harming me, then I could just blow off other people's reactions to my own egoism. But as soon as you care about anything that anyone does, like, please don't step on my foot, please don't kill me, then you are in conversation with them, and you can't say my interests count and yours don't because I'm me and you're not. So the rational justification of morality, its existence as a kind of normative system that cannot be just reduced to our own gut feelings, is a combination of self-interest. Now, that is not rationally justifiable, but it's pretty likely in any product of natural selection. You'd really rather live than die. You'd rather be healthy than sick. You'd rather be intact than mutilated. Combine that with impartiality, or the interchangeability of perspectives, the fact that me versus you makes no logical difference, and you get morality, namely, kind of treat others as you would want them to treat you. It's how we teach morality to children. What do we do to inculcate a moral sense in children? We say, how would you like it if he did that to you? And you find it repeatedly as the core of the world's moral systems, as the golden rule found in many religions. As Rabbi Hillel said when he was challenged to explain the entire Torah while standing on one leg, what is hateful to you, do not do to others. That's the whole Torah. The rest is just commentary. Baruch Spinoza advocated taking the viewpoint of eternity, rising above your parochial vantage point. Thomas Nagel wrote a book called The View from Nowhere as a basis for morality. John Rawls defined justice as choosing a social arrangement from behind a veil of ignorance about your own talents and traits in the society that you are designing. And Immanuel Kant proposed the categorical imperative, actually two categorical imperatives, both of which make some connection to impartiality, act only to that maxim whereby you can will that it should become a universal law. If whatever you do, imagine what it would be like if everyone did it. For that matter, utilitarianism, often introduced as the opposite to Kant's moral philosophy, but actually overlapping with it, as we will see. The greatest good for the greatest number implies that all lives have equal value, not just the greatest good for me, but the greatest good for everyone. You can also justify morality in the sense of impartiality, not just from the interchangeability of perspectives, the fact that pronouns make no difference. But it is in game theoretic terms, it's an equilibrium in a non-zero sum game that ultimately gives you the best payoff, the best welfare. Imagine yourself deciding whether to be a selfish bastard, an egoist who cares only about yourself and exploits everyone else with impunity, or an altruist who takes other people's interests into account. What is the best strategy? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends a lot on what the other guy does. Whether he or she is also a self-interested, psychopathic, rapacious egoist, or is an altruist. The result depends on what's good for you or what's not so good for you, depends on what the other guy does. So let's just consider the four possibilities. If you are an egoist and so is everyone else, then you're in a state of war of all against all. Let's call it a payoff of -50. If you are, and that's pretty bad. If you are a altruist, that is, if you are good to others while everyone else is an egoist, they are exploiters, you're kind of a doormat, and that's the worst possible situation. If you are a selfish bastard and others are altruists, you get to exploit them with impunity. So you get to enjoy, say, 10 points. The benefit to the exploiter is always less than the cost to the exploitee, the doormat. If you kill someone, you can maybe steal their money, steal their girlfriend. That's still the good that it does to you cannot be compared with the harm it does to them, and that's generally true of good and harm. But if you can somehow get yourself into the cell where you are an altruist and the other guy is an altruist, you get the benefits of cooperation. Each of you will rescue the other from drowning. Neither of you will kill or maim or rob the other. And even though it's not as good as being able to exploit someone, if you have the choice between not exploiting but also not being exploited, the asymmetry works out that that's really the cell you want to end up in. That is, you want a universal code of impartiality. Self, you should be an altruist, others should be as well. Now, I alluded to the contrast between two styles of moral philosophy. In Moral Philosophy 101, every undergraduate gets introduced to this distinction, sometimes introduced as a dichotomy between consequentialism and deontology, deontological ethics. The reason it is relevant to effective altruism is that effective altruism really grew out of the style of moral philosophy called consequentialism, closely related to utilitarianism. I mentioned that this is a philanthropic movement, a moral movement, a life philosophy that grew out of academic philosophy. The part of academic philosophy that it is most connected to is the philosophy of consequentialism. Again, apologies to those of you who've taken moral philosophy, or for that matter, intro philosophy in general. But consequentialism, just to remind you all, is that the morality of an act depends on its consequences. Utilitarianism is the subtype of consequentialism that say that the consequences that matter are utility. Utility is not what it sounds like. It just means what you want, what you like, more or less happiness. Although utilitarianism does not imply that the goal of an individual, that utility per se is only selfish benefit. If you get a warm glow when your spouse, when your child, when your friend also benefits, that can count as your own utility as well. It's anything that you seek, that you want. The greatest good for the greatest number is sometimes the slogan that is associated with consequentialism. Deontology suggests that instead acts are moral or immoral by their very nature. Before you know what the long-term or even short-term outcome is, just watching the guy do it, that's enough to tell you whether it's moral or not. Religious commandments are one subtype of deontology. God commands it, that makes it wrong. That's all there is to it. The categorical imperative of Kant can be considered a kind of deontological ethics. I already mentioned act only according to that maxim whereby you can will that it should be a universal law. And the other variant, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always as an end. There too, you've got impartiality kind of folded into it. You don't just use another person as for your own benefit, but you consider their benefit. Now, utilitarianism does mention that it is ultimately the motivator of effective altruism, and as a moral philosophy, there's a lot to be said for it. It's simple, neutral, it's agnostic as to any of the world's religions. You don't have to be a Catholic, you don't have to be a Jew, you don't have to believe anything in order to understand it and apply to it, and it's kind of easy to justify. It corresponds with intuitions like no harm, no foul. If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad, from the great moral philosopher Sheryl Crow. What consenting adults do in private is no one else's concern. If you believe those things, you're kind of a consequentialist. And historically, consequentialism, utilitarianism in particular, is responsible for an awful lot of moral progress. It has overcome a lot of religious and traditional and instinctual prohibitions that seemed intuitively compelling in their day, but which we now realize can be morally horrific. That is, utilitarianism is a way of cutting through a lot of moral intuitions and seeking a more rational defensive basis for our moral judgments. I'm going to give you some examples of awful practices thought to be moral in their day that were eliminated historically by the application of utilitarian arguments, such as cruel punishments like breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half from the crotch down, and impalement. Now, these used to be considered not immoral, but moral. They were justice being done up through the 18th century. Our Eighth Amendment, with its prohibition of cruel and unusual punishments, well, you just saw what they kind of had in mind by cruel and unusual punishments. It required a moral revolution to come to the conclusion that presumably we all share, that was not justice, that was a moral horror. The arguments probably were stated most clearly by Cesare Beccaria, who historically probably deserves credit as the founder of utilitarianism, although it's usually Bentham and Mill that get the kudos. But Beccaria wrote, for a punishment to achieve its objective, it is only necessary that the harm it inflicts outweighs the benefit that derives from the crime, and into this calculation ought to be factored the certainty of punishment and the loss of the good that the commission of the crime would produce. Everything beyond this is superfluous and therefore tyrannical. That is, we impose punishments not in order to implement some cosmic scale of justice, but to make sure that committing harmful acts ends up being more costly than the ill-gotten gains. And so that potential Malefactors, wrongdoers, bad guys think, well, if I do this, yeah, if I rob a liquor store, I might get a lot of money. But on the other hand, the chances that I'll be put in jail means that overall this is a bad gamble. That's the only reason that we should have punishment. Anything beyond that incentive structure is simply sadism, Beccaria argued. It's the basis for the Eighth Amendment. It is the basis for the abolition of judicial torture, of capital punishment, particularly for victimless crimes, and indeed ought to be, I think, our lodestar, our touchstone for making sense of criminal punishment today. Why do we put people in jail? Why do we fine them? The answer is to set up an incentive structure so that fewer people commit harmful acts. Beyond that, you are just perpetrating harm. And animal rights. It is not a coincidence that the animal rights movement, modern animal rights movement, was jump-started by Peter Singer in his book Animal Liberation from 1975, and that Peter Singer is the world's most prominent utilitarian philosopher, because it is a utilitarian argument that says human schmooman makes no difference. As Jeremy Bentham put it, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Gay rights. We think of that as an issue of the 20th century, starting with perhaps with the Stonewall demonstrations of the 1970s. But in fact, again, it was Jeremy Bentham, one of the heroes of utilitarianism, who stated the argument in as clear a form as has ever been stated. And by the way, he made this argument in the 18th century. And this is really a revolutionary argument in its time. As to any primary mischief, it is evident that it, homosexual sexual activity, produces no pain in anyone. On the contrary, it produces pleasure. The partners are both willing. If either of them be unwilling, the act is an offense totally different in its nature of effects. It is a personal injury. It is a kind of rape. As to any danger exclusive of pain, the danger, if any, must consist in the tendency of the example. But what is the tendency of this example? To dispose others to engage in the same practices, that this practice produces not pain of any kind to anyone. It doesn't get any clearer than that. Religious persecution. Why should we stop burning heretics? Well, I think Thomas Jefferson made an excellent utilitarian argument. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Again, a utilitarian argument par excellence. Also, I think the historical record would show that women's rights, the idea that there's no such thing as a natural place or natural role for women, from John Stuart Mill, his essay, The Subjection of Women, influenced, of course, by other thinkers such as Mary Astell, Harriet Mill, his other half, Mary Wollstonecraft. Universal education, workers' rights, environmental protection, a lot of these causes were justified in their time, but with utilitarian arguments. Now, I think, okay, I will quickly go over the, turning now from a historical question and a philosophical question to a psychological question. Are people intuitive utilitarians or deontologists? I mentioned that the utilitarian has some psychological appeal, no harm, no foul, for example, but there's also a line of research that shows that deontology does have a hold on our intuitions, and it is a, by now, famous thought experiment that makes that starkly clear, originated by the philosopher Philippa Foot, called the trolley problem. I'm sure you've all heard it. Maybe you've been subjects in a demonstration. Trolley is hurtling out of control and is bearing down on 5 railroad workers who don't see it coming. You're standing by a switch and can divert the trolley onto another track, though it will then kill a single worker who hasn't noticed the danger either. Should you save 5 lives at the cost of 1 by switching the track? 90% of people say yes. It's a kind of no-brainer utilitarian argument. 1 death versus 5 deaths. 1 death is better. Now imagine alternative, you are on a bridge overlooking the tracks and spotted the runaway train bearing down on 5 workers. The only way to stop it is to throw a heavy object in its path. and the only heavy object within reach is a fat man standing next to you should you throw the man over the bridge. In terms of consequences, it's the same dilemma. Kill one to save five, but a majority of people now say no. The utilitarian judgment in both cases say do it. There's a deontological judgment. People must be treated as ends, never as means, and the idea of manhandling someone and deliberately causing his death would outweigh the net 4 lives saved. It invokes some psychological influences of our moral intuitions. We feel that acting directly is morally different from enabling something to take place. Morally, one could argue that that makes no difference, but psychologically it makes a big difference, perhaps because of a repugnance that we evolved with against physically harming a stranger without provocation, and that might, like the incest repugnance, bleed into a moral intuition. Well, could one even argue that deontology, which is going back to Immanuel Kant and others, is often considered the more sophisticated, more prestigious, the high-class moral philosophy, could it actually be a spillover from our emotions, our evolutionarily adapted gut feelings? This is the rather naughty suggestion made by my colleague, Joshua Green, professor in the psychology department here, who did a number of experiments on the psychological roots of utilitarian versus deontological thinking, and suggested that deontology might indeed be a spillover from gut feelings. Gave the trolley problem to people in the scanner, the crying baby dilemma, another philosophy 101 illustration of the tension between consequentialism and utilitarianism. You're hiding in a basement from the Gestapo. You have an infant. If the infant cries, it will divulge your location to the Gestapo, who will then arrest and kill everyone, including the baby, should you smother the baby to save the family. Again, it's a very good probe of our moral intuitions. What Josh Green found is that when people are in the scanner and asked to think through these dilemmas, the deontological or personal judgments, that is, don't throw the fat man off the bridge, don't smother the baby, tend to activate the emotional circuitry of the brain. The utilitarian judgments, impersonal ones, yeah, toss the fat man, strangle the baby, 4 deaths, 1 death is better than 5 deaths. It tends to activate the problem-solving circuitry of the brain. That is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, also involved in working memory, whereas the deontological judgments tend to activate the cingulate and the ventromedial cortex, which are involved in integrating emotion with thought. Josh also found that there are other associations between consequentialist or utilitarian responses and the suppression of emotion and the encouragement of rational thinking. Patients who have lesions in medial prefrontal cortex, which impairs the ability to integrate your emotions with your actions, made famous by the 19th century railroad worker Phineas Gage, who had a spike impale his ventromedial prefrontal cortex and became impulsive and emotional. They are more likely to make the deontological judgments, to put people in a good mood. They are more likely to make utilitarian. I'm sorry, I had it the other way around. It's the patients with the lesions in prefrontal medial cortex who are more likely to be utilitarian, put people in a good mood. If you give people instructions to distrust their intuitions and be more reflective, they are more likely to throw the fat man over. People who describe themselves as less impulsive and more rational are more likely to make utilitarian judgments. And people who do well on the cognitive reflection test, a 3-item test of cognitive impulsivity, are likelier to make the utilitarian judgment, that is, throw the fat man over. Conversely, people who describe themselves as impulsive are likelier to spare the fat man even if 5 workers get killed, If you put them under time pressure, so they have to go with their snap judgment. If you have them keep items in memory, so you distract them so they can't think about it, then they are likely to spare the fat man, and so on. So this is, as I mentioned, it's kind of a naughty suggestion. It is an intrusion into moral philosophy from cognitive neuroscience and psychology. Philosophers hate that. Do any of these arguments, historical, psychological, or philosophical, show that we should all be utilitarians? Which, of course, might imply we should all become effective altruists. Well, again, I'm going to remind you of things that any of you who've taken Intro to Moral Philosophy know. There are objections to utilitarianism. They also clash with what we tend to agree is right and wrong. If there is a young girl has been brutally murdered, we don't know who did it, the town threatens a riot, should the sheriff string up the town drunk, even though he was innocent, to assuage the mob and prevent a greater number of deaths? Most of them would say, even if that would kill one to save many, you shouldn't do it. It would be unjust. Someone checks into a hospital. There are 5 people with dying of organ failure, each of which needs an organ for donation. One needs a heart, one needs a liver, one needs a kidney, and so on. Should you euthanize the patient, harvest his organs, save one at the cost of 5? Most people would say, nah, that's, you should not sacrifice one to save 5. There's the utility monster. If you could imagine some sicko pervert who gets more pleasure out of torturing people than they get from living, should you indulge him? Someone told me there was a punk rock band called the Utility Monsters. And the repugnant conclusion from Derek Parfit, I won't read the quote, but if you could set up a rabbit gratification warehouse chain where you keep millions of rabbits alive who are enjoying their lives, is that where we should divert our national wealth if that produces the greatest amount of happiness? And one more weird implication of utilitarianism, sometimes called natalism. Since people get more pleasure from being alive than not existing, we should all have as many babies as possible, the more the merrier. Now, utilitarians can defend themselves against these objections. Greatest good needn't mean average good. You could have other ways of trading off and combining competing utilities, such as minimize the maximum amount of suffering, including death. There's a distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. That is, does being a utilitarian mean you calculate for every time you move your muscles, will that do more good than harm? Versus should you set up moral rules that when people follow them result in more good than harm? And one could say, in response to these rather outlandish thought experiments against utilitarianism, well, let's say we did give doctors the power to euthanize healthy patients when they thought it would save more lives. Let's say you had hospital patients understand that when they went in for an operation on their toe, they may be euthanized and might never wake up from anesthesia. Would that bring the greatest good to the greatest number? Not so clear. Or let's say you legally empower people to throw other people to their deaths when they calculate that it would save more lives. What could possibly go wrong? Well, one could say that in fact, there is a rule utilitarianism that would rule out these outlandish thought experiments of the involuntary organ donor, consistent with the idea that our policies should result in the greatest amount of welfare. Also, a lot of the thought experiments on absurd versions of utilitarianism assume perfect knowledge and goodness. You know exactly how many lives will be saved. You know that throwing the fat man over the bridge will stop the trolley. Your intuitive physics is good enough to predict that. You know that the men would not scramble away otherwise. And if the fat guy standing next to you happened to be competing for a slot in graduate school, that wouldn't influence your decision at all. Well, when you factor in that we are not omniscient, infallible demigods, but we are ignorant, flawed humans. That is, their limitations on knowledge, wisdom, and impartiality. You might want to say, well, let's draw some bright lines that we just don't let humans cross, like don't kill innocent people. Now, that sounds like a principle. It sounds kind of deontological, but it would result, given that humans are humans, in the greatest good for the greatest number. So one could even say, why can't we all get along? Let's make nice, like the 12-year-old girl at the debate last night. Given human limitations, perhaps the contrast between deontology and utilitarianism has been drawn too sharply, and that certain deontological rules just happen to be the ways that we bring about the greatest human welfare. Also, deontological theories are vulnerable to counterexamples, such as, again, Gestapo come to the door. The family is hiding Anne Frank and her family in the attic. The Gestapo say, any Jews in your house? Should they lie? Well, if lying is wrong, then a deontologist, at least an extreme one, which should say, I cannot tell a lie, we've got a Jewish family hiding in our attic. Most of us would say that that is kind of monstrous. Kant had an argument that masturbation is immoral because you're treating yourself as a means rather than an end. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of what we now consider crazy bioethical prohibitions like blood transfusions and organ donations that in their day were ruled out or at least opposed for deontological reasons. They breached some principle like the sanctity of human blood that we now recognize are obsolete. Or interracial marriage, homosexuality. You could pull deontological principles out of the air that make those immoral even if no one is harmed, and it casts doubt on the idea that we should always invoke principles. Okay, finally, let me conclude. I've given some arguments why utilitarianism has a lot going for it, especially in its rule version that might shade into deontology. I've given arguments that our moral intuitions, our repugnances, our feelings that this is just horrific, perhaps ought to be discounted. Should we all become effective altruists? Well, maybe, but the individual arguments must still be evaluated. And I should have made this clear to begin with, that effective altruism is not a creed, it's not a religion, it's not a pre-existing code, it's not a list of commandments. It is an approach. It is the imperative to apply reason to consider who is harmed, who is helped in making our moral decisions. So it's particularly philanthropic ones and personal ones, so it is an application of utilitarianism. And some of the arguments you could dispute. If you thought that some of the examples, like you got to save the unrelated child instead of your own daughter, you ought to give away all of your money except the bare minimum to survive. If you thought that can't be right, if you should worry more about averting the possibility of a paperclip maximizer than, say, helping the homeless, yes, you can come back with arguments why perhaps effective altruism are arguments that have gone off the rails. So why? Well, some assume perfect knowledge and an ability to forecast into the indefinite future. In particular, far future arguments, which have become an increasing portion of effective altruism discussions. That is, we ought to maximize the welfare of our trillions of descendants as opposed to people alive now. Some are vulnerable to what's called the St. Petersburg paradox, familiar to those of you, many from economics. Should I accept a bet of $2 if the coin comes up heads, $4 if tails then heads, $8 if tails then heads. If you do the math, it's worth an infinite amount of money. Most people would not pay a lot to play that game, to take on that bet. Likewise, The idea that we should weight the welfare of trillions of people in the future, even if we are very uncertain about what that is, and even if the welfare is very small, has the dubious multiplication of big numbers in the future times small benefit or small certainty for benefit ends up with a big value. Some of them kind of blow off human virtues, the kind of moral sense that we have to draw on, the material that we have to work with in asking people to be good as opposed to selfish, and demand a kind of frigid superhuman impartiality that is really not realistic to ask people to do. So yeah, maybe there's a good argument for saving two unrelated kids as opposed to your own little boy or your own little girl. But do you really want to demand that that's how people should think and act? They're going to say, sorry, if that's your morality, I'm going back to the Bible, or I'm going back to my gut feelings. There is a saying in moral philosophy from Kant, ought implies can. You cannot have a moral principle that no mortal can adhere to. And some of the ethically imperative conclusions from effective altruism in its extreme form may be things that very few mortal people are capable of doing. Some of them prioritize extreme hypotheticals over pressing actual needs, such as the idea that we should devote all of our attention to preventing there from being a malevolent, omnipotent AI that turns us into paperclips, as opposed to feeding the homeless. There could be an effective altruist argument that, well, geez, if the paperclip maximizer wiped out humanity, that's trillions of lives, and one hungry guy out of the alley, how can you compare? Well, there's something a little off with that argument. And some economists say, if you really want to do the most good in the developing world, if you want to minimize disease and hunger and maximize education and happiness, well, you really can't beat good old-fashioned economic development. And maybe concentrating so much on philanthropy, on charity, on alms is the wrong approach. China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. They're no longer starving and stunted and diseased, not because we chose effective charities to shovel lots of our savings to China, but because China built factories and roads and power plants. And that if ultimately what you want to do is maximize well-being in the world, then you shouldn't concentrate on philanthropy, you should concentrate on economic development. Nonetheless, just to reassure you that I have not, first of all, set up what's so great about effective altruism and then said, nah, forget it, not so great after all. Even if you don't become the extreme, perfect, uber rational effective altruist, we could do a lot better. You could donate more to charity than you do, even if you aren't donating everything above subsistence to charity. We could donate to more effective charities, and there are big differences, and perhaps a lot of our charitable giving is directed too much to ethically irrelevant personal causes. You could choose a career in activities, at least taking into account how much good you will do in making those choices. We can recalibrate some of our moral intuitions to free ourselves of some of the illusions that may be spillovers from evolutionarily primitive emotions and think more, well, really, who's better off, who's worse off. And in the political arena, we could identify and support policies that are likely to do the most good for humanity, rather than those that conform to some political ideology, something particularly relevant in this particular season. Okay, I will stop talking. Thank you for the invitation, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much to Professor Pinker. That was an
I'm sorry, by the way, I only left
wonderful...
about 15 minutes for questioning, and then I have to go. I went on a bit. I apologize.
Not at all. Yes, as you might guess, we certainly have a bunch of questions and will not be able to get to all of them, but thank you so much for your terrific presentation and for the many terrific questions that are coming in. I'm Andy Stavas. I'm the president of Harvard Law School Effective Altruism. And at the outset, I'd also like to thank all the attendees and our many, many co-sponsors far too numerous to list here. And again, I apologize in advance that we won't get to every wonderful question that we've got in. First, just a logistical one I can take is whether the talk will be recorded. It is indeed being recorded, and where to watch it is a common question. In some time, we are going to post it to Harvard Law Effective Altruism's website, maybe other places as well. Michelle is going to put the link to our website in the chat so you can bookmark it. We received several questions on the theme of, of effective altruism not being equated with utilitarianism, which some might take issue with just on the fact that some effective altruists are not utilitarians. So just to clarify what you believe the relationship between the two concepts, utilitarianism and effective altruism are, for example, whether utilitarianism is sufficient but not necessary to yield EA conclusions, maybe both necessary and sufficient. I'm curious your take on that.
Yeah, that's probably a question better directed at people like Will MacAskill, who is a razor-sharp philosopher and one of the founders and activists in effective altruism. I shouldn't say that they're the same. They are intimately related, and effective altruism would be, particularly when it applies to philanthropy, would be a practical application of utilitarian moral philosophy. But probably something that ought to be looked at in the writings of MacAskill, of Ord, of Singer, of others.
Thank you. Forgive me in advance for anybody whose name I butcher, but Benjamin Langlois-Therian asks, in the context of effective altruism, how do you navigate the balance between doing good and enhancing your own well-being?
Yeah, it is I mean, I think that's the crux of the issue. In the limit, the most extreme defensible version is that you don't count any more or less than anyone else on the planet, which would mean that however much money you have, you give away all that you need other than what you need to live on, or what others. I mean, there are a number of asterisks and so on. There has to be at least enough of an incentive so that you'll earn the money in the first place. That is, you'll do the add value to the world. If you don't get any of it, you won't do it, and everyone will be worse off. So if there's confiscatory taxation, or then that might end up lowering aggregate welfare. And again, there's if you demand of people accept this philosophy, which means treat yourself and your kids and and all the people you love as worth nothing compared to the welfare of strangers halfway across the globe, you're just going to lose a lot of people practically. So it's a profound issue with whose conclusions are not completely obvious. If you go into the literature in moral philosophy, you will see these played out.
Thank you for that. Jason Crawford asks if EA values future and potential lives at least almost as much as current ones. Just to refine, I know you touched on some of the points like the repugnant conclusion, but do you view EA as strongly pro-natalist, anti-abortion, or anti-contraception?
It's a really good question. That is, if you're if you believe that that unborn, in the sense of people who will appear in 2200, are as valuable as people who are alive today, what are the implications for your views on abortion? And I have not seen that played out, although I have raised that question myself. There's also, by the way, an anti-natalist argument that, since associated with a philosopher in South Africa named David Benatar, that since life is a vale of tears, and life sucks and then you die, and we all, being human means you have a lot of suffering, you're going to get sick, you're going to die, we all do, you're going to lose your relatives, and we're better off not being born. And so we should all take contraception and voluntarily go out of existence. So the answer to that is not completely obvious. I would add that economists would say, and I think philosophers would agree, that we ought to discount the future. We should not treat a life in 2100 the same as we treat a life today, for a number of reasons. One of them is if we get wiped out by an asteroid in 2050, all the sacrifice now will have gone to waste, and you never know what will happen. There's a non-zero probability that that person in 2100 will never come into existence. That means that there's an exponential discounting of future lives that can be defended. Also, our knowledge plummets exponentially as we go into the future. If I can do 10 things now, and in response to everything I do, 10 things could happen. And in response to every one of those 10 things, I could do 10 things, and so on in the future. And I don't know for sure how the future is going to unfold. It means that it doesn't take very long before I know nothing. And so if I make plans now to benefit my great-great-great-great-grandchildren, I'll probably be full of malarkey, and anything that I do any sacrifice that I make on an anticipation of what my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild will want, should he exist or she in the first place, will have gone to waste. And so that is very much part of the debate in the intersection between economics and moral philosophy.
We have two related questions. I'll ask both of them up front, and feel free to take them however you will. One is from Daniel Johnson. When we look back on institutions such as slavery or child sacrifice, which were commonplace in the past, we often struggle to comprehend how they could have been permitted for so long. What current state of affairs do you think will be perceived by future generations as similarly barbaric? That's question one. Question two is from Julia Sebastian. How do we avoid the presentist fallacy, that is, contextualizing the past only in terms of the present and attendant risks of Eurocentrism, tunnel vision, and naturalization of things that evolved for sort of random, circumstantial, or even profitable reasons?
Yeah. Well, for the first, different people have different lists, but I think probably a lot of us would say that treatment of animals, particularly in factory farms, will be viewed as barbaric by future generations. I think the possession of nuclear weapons will be considered to be a almost incomprehensible form of insanity. It's possible that our imprisonment policies now do not satisfy Beccaриa's principle that they should be exactly as much disincentive to exploitation and no more. Possibly fossil fuel emissions that imperil future generations. Anyway, those are four, and other people will have other lists, and there are probably others that don't occur to us precisely because we are trapped in our own set of moral assumptions, which relates to the second question. And the answer is we ought to try to circumvent the biases of the present. That's what a lot of moral argumentation is all about. Outlandish thought experiments, taking others' point of view, having a diverse set of participants in the debate, precisely because that kind of Eurocentrism or other forms of parochialism or egocentrism are impediments to coming up with the most defensible moral conclusions.
We have one question from David Ehrenreich that asks whether consequentialism can account for the following judgments. First, that helping others out of a care for their well-being is more valuable than helping someone out of self-interest, even if they result in the same utility. Second, that a virtuous life is more valuable than a vicious one, even if they promote equal amounts of utility. And third, it's better to allow one person to live a dignified human life, say by providing with basic needs, than to increase utility of a person who already has the basic needs met and is already capable of living a dignified life.
Yes, so let's see. They involve utilitarian or consequentialist considerations to different extents. The idea that if you benefit someone out of selfless motives versus selfish motives, I think a hardcore utilitarian would say, what difference does it make? If they're better off, and who cares what's going on in the depths of your soul? Now, I think one could modify that, and I didn't talk about the third philosophy 101 moral philosophy, virtue ethics, associated with Aristotle, that being a virtue, that morality comes from having the right character traits, acting out of benevolence and charity and moderation and honesty and so on. Now, it may be that, as with the contrast between deontological and consequentialist ethics, it may be drawn too sharply that when you have virtuous people who cultivate the right character traits and do things out of benevolence rather than selfishness, on average, over the long run, they're probably going to do more good things and benefit more people. And so given that we are talking about human beings and who don't, in reality, calculate the harm and good of every act they do, but we do often act out of habit and instinct. If those habits and instincts are aligned with the overall outcome of people being better off, then we should encourage them and value them, even if in one particular instance it makes no difference. By the way, I've done experiments on this with Julian DeFreitas, a graduate student in psychology here at Harvard. We've shown that, in fact, there is a big difference between third-party judgments and beneficiary judgments in charitable donation. If you ask people to judge who's better, someone who gives away a lot of money but claims a lot of credit and gets, a lot of glory, versus someone who gives a smaller amount anonymously, people will say the guy who gives anonymously is more virtuous. You say to another group of people, well, imagine that you are the family in need, and some guy brags how generous he is and gives you a lot of money, versus someone else gives you much less money, but he keeps it anonymous and it's virtuous and altruistic. People will say, I don't care what the guy claims. I don't care how much credit he seeks. If I need the money, I need the money. So the arguments there can go both ways. And I would say the way to resolve them is the person with the purer motives on average will do more good, but ultimately what counts is how much good is being done. And I think that's an answer to the helps answer the second question as well. That there is a thing of virtue ethics whose ultimate value might come from the consequences that it brings about. And now I have Andy, do you remember the third question? I'm sorry, I just flew out of my brain.
Yes. It is that it's better to allow one person to live a dignified human life than to increase the utility equally of another person who already has basic needs met.
Oh yes, well this at least partly relates to the decelerating function of utility as opposed to actual quantitative value. Namely, the extra $1,000 increases the well-being of the poor person much more than the rich person. For things like dignity, above and beyond just dollars, utility doesn't mean dollars. It means stuff we want, stuff that makes us better off, stuff that we seek, and that would include dignity and more non-material values as well as cash.
Right, thank you so much. I see that we're approaching 1:30. We didn't get to many terrific questions, including one that I just saw come in from Max Bazerman, which actually I wanted to mention that Professor Bazerman is going to be giving a talk on Tuesday, October 20th at noon on his book, Better Not Perfect. That is going to be hosted by Harvard Graduate Students of Arts and Science, Graduate School of Arts and Science Effective Altruism group. Also for law students, if anyone is interested, on Thursday, the 22nd of October, also at noon Eastern time, we will host Cullen O'Keefe, an alumnus of Harvard Law School, on how to do the most good with your law degree. We're going to be sending out detailed information to all attendees via email. Please feel free to sign up to join your school's Effective Altruism chapter, and look at the chat because Michelle is going to be sending EA directory to help you find your Effective Altruism chapter. I want to again thank every one of the terrific co-sponsors and attendees, and especially thank you so much to Professor Pinker. Again, if we didn't get to any of your questions, feel free to discuss them with members of your student chapters. They are terrific and I think worth a lot of thought and discussion. So, we've gotten a lot to think about from Professor Pinker. So thank you so much for this terrific talk.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Yemi.